The woman they dismissed as living in the past just saved 43 soldiers using techniques older than gunpowder. 6 hours earlier, she was being ridiculed by tactical experts who believed her grandfather's methods belonged in a museum. They had no idea that when satellites fail and communications die, the oldest lessons become the newest hope. Everyone who laughed at her hand-drawn maps and compass navigation was about to discover why indigenous wisdom survived millennia while modern systems crashed in minutes. Because Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Stone wasn't just any strategist. She was the last keeper of Apache warfare traditions. And today, those ancient methods would prove that sometimes the future requires remembering the past. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning desert sun cast harsh shadows across the sprawling Fort Braxton Advanced Tactical Training Center in Nevada, where cutting-edge military technology met the unforgiving landscape that had tested warriors for generations. This wasn't merely another training facility dotted across the American Southwest. It was the crown jewel of modern warfare education, where elite units from every branch of service came to master the latest innovations in combat strategy, satellite-guided operations, and digital battlefield management. The facility hummed with the constant energy of progress, its buildings filled with screens displaying real-time intelligence, drone footage, and tactical overlays that promised to revolutionize how America fought its wars. Within these walls, tradition was often viewed as an obstacle to advancement. The philosophy pervading every corridor and classroom emphasized adaptation, technological superiority, and the relentless pursuit of efficiency through innovation. Officers who spoke of historical tactics were politely tolerated at best, openly dismissed at worst. The institutional culture had shifted dramatically over the past decade, embracing a future where algorithms predicted enemy movements, artificial intelligence analyzed battlefield patterns, and soldiers relied on sophisticated equipment that could see through walls, communicate across continents, and coordinate strikes with pinpoint accuracy. Major General Patricia Hawkins ruled this technological kingdom with the confidence of someone who had witnessed the transformation of warfare from analog to digital. Her 30-year career had paralleled the military's evolution, and she took personal pride in leading the charge toward modernization. Under her command, Fort Braxton had become synonymous with innovation, attracting the brightest minds in tactical development and serving as a testing ground for concepts that would define combat for generations to come. She moved through the facility with the assured stride of a leader who had successfully navigated every technological revolution the military had faced. The Advanced Tactical Simulation Room represented the pinnacle of military training technology. Holographic displays projected three-dimensional battlefields where officers could manipulate virtual units, test strategies against sophisticated AI opponents, and experience combat scenarios without risking actual lives. The room's walls were lined with monitors showing satellite feeds, intelligence reports, and real-time data streams that painted a comprehensive picture of any operational environment. Every surface gleamed with the sterile perfection of cutting-edge equipment, and the air itself seemed to vibrate with the electronic hum of processing power. Into this temple of technological warfare walked Rebecca Stone, carrying nothing more than a weathered leather satchel and wearing the kind of quiet confidence that comes from understanding principles that transcend gadgets. Her appearance immediately marked her as different from the typical Fort Braxton trainee, where others carried tablets and wore the latest tactical gear. She moved with the economy of motion that spoke of different training, different priorities, different understanding of what warfare actually required. Her long black hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and her dark eyes held the kind of depth that suggested she saw things others missed. Rebecca's heritage was written in her features and her bearing. She carried herself with the dignity of someone connected to a warrior tradition that predated the United States itself. Her great-grandfather had been a respected Apache scout who had served alongside the legendary Geronimo, learning the art of warfare in an environment where survival depended on reading the landscape, understanding weather patterns, and moving through hostile territory using nothing but knowledge passed down through generations. Her grandfather had carried these traditions forward, adapting ancient wisdom to serve in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam, proving that indigenous tactical knowledge could complement modern military operations. The training program Rebecca had enrolled in was specifically designed for senior officers transitioning into advisory roles, where they would be expected to train the next generation of military leaders. The curriculum focused heavily on integrating emerging technologies with established tactical doctrine, preparing participants to lead forces equipped with the most advanced systems available. Every other participant in the program arrived with backgrounds in cybersecurity, drone operations, satellite communications, or electronic warfare. They spoke fluently about data analytics, predictive modeling, and artificial intelligence applications in combat environments. When Rebecca quietly introduced herself during the opening session, mentioning her background in traditional navigation and indigenous tactical methods, the response was polite but unmistakably condescending. Her fellow officers smiled with the kind of patronizing tolerance reserved for quite historical curiosities. They had all heard stories about Native American scouts and their supposed supernatural abilities to track enemies across impossible terrain. But such tales belonged to the romantic mythology of the Old West, not the sterile reality of modern warfare, where battles were won through superior technology and overwhelming information advantage. Colonel James Morrison, the program's lead instructor, embodied everything the modern military valued in its leadership. His background in military intelligence had positioned him at the forefront of technological integration, and his doctoral dissertation on artificial intelligence applications in tactical planning had established him as a thought leader in his field. He spoke with the authority of someone who had successfully implemented cutting-edge solutions in real combat situations, and his presentations were masterclasses in how technology could overcome traditional military limitations. Morrison's initial assessment of Rebecca was swift and dismissive. Her personnel file showed competence in conventional military operations, but her emphasis on what she called environmental tactical awareness struck him as outdated, thinking that had no place in contemporary warfare. During their first interaction, when Rebecca mentioned the importance of understanding weather patterns and terrain features that couldn't be captured by satellite imagery, Morrison's response was a lecture on how modern meteorological data and topographical mapping had rendered such primitive methods obsolete. The other participants in the program represented the cream of the military's technological elite. Captain David Chun specialized in cyber warfare and had developed protocols for disrupting enemy communications that were being implemented across multiple theaters of operation. Major Sarah Williams led a team that integrated drone swarms with ground operations, creating tactical advantages that previous generations of warriors could never have imagined. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Johnson had pioneered the use of artificial intelligence in predictive combat modeling, allowing commanders to anticipate enemy movements with unprecedented accuracy. These officers looked at Rebecca's traditional methods with the same mixture of amusement and bewilderment that archaeologists might reserve for stone tools discovered in a modern city. They couldn't understand why anyone would choose to rely on compass navigation when GPS systems provided instant positioning data. They found it incomprehensible that someone would waste time studying cloud formations when satellite weather reports delivered precise forecasts updated every few minutes. The idea that human intuition and ancestral knowledge could compete with computer algorithms and sensor networks seemed not just outdated, but actively counterproductive. The facility state-of-the-art equipment reinforced this technological supremacy at every turn. Tactical planning sessions took place in rooms where officers could manipulate holographic representations of battlefield terrain, zooming in on specific locations with resolution that revealed individual rocks and vegetation patterns. Communication. Exercises utilized satellite networks that could maintain contact across global distances, even in the most remote environments. Navigation training focused on GPS systems so sophisticated that they could guide soldiers to within inches of their intended destinations, even in urban environments where traditional landmarks were obscured. Rebecca's quiet presence in this high-tech environment was like a time traveler who had somehow wandered into the wrong century. When she pulled out a hand-drawn map during a navigation exercise, the collective reaction was barely concealed laughter. Her compass, worn smooth by decades of use, looked like a museum piece compared to the digital navigation systems her fellow officers carried. The leather journal where she recorded weather observations and terrain features seemed quaint and unnecessary in an age where sensors could provide instant environmental data. The cultural divide became apparent during the first major simulation exercise. While other participants immediately began accessing satellite feeds and deploying drone reconnaissance, Rebecca spent the opening minutes of the scenario simply observing. She studied the simulated terrain with the intensity of someone reading a book written in a language others couldn't understand. She noted wind patterns, examined elevation changes, and identified natural corridors that didn't appear on any digital map, but would be crucial for actual movement through the environment. Morrison watched her behavior with growing irritation. The exercise was designed to test participants' ability to integrate multiple information sources and make rapid decisions based on technological advantages. Rebecca's methodical approach to environmental analysis was consuming valuable time that could be better spent coordinating with support elements and establishing communication networks. When she finally began moving her units, her tactics seemed conservative and predictable compared to the aggressive technological approaches her peers were implementing. The mockery began, subtly with raised eyebrows and suppressed smiles when Rebecca consulted her compass instead of her GPS unit. It escalated during debriefing sessions when she would suggest that certain tactical decisions should be based on environmental factors that weren't captured in the digital representations. Her observations about how weather patterns might affect helicopter operations or how terrain features could create communication dead zones were dismissed as overthinking problems that modern technology had already solved. Captain Chen was particularly vocal in his criticism of what he called Stone Age tactical thinking. During one memorable exchange, he pointed out that Rebecca's emphasis on understanding natural navigation landmarks was completely irrelevant in an age where every soldier carried multiple GPS systems and backup communication devices. His presentation on how cyber warfare could disrupt enemy navigation systems was met with enthusiastic approval from both instructors and fellow participants, while Rebecca's quiet suggestion that such systems could be vulnerable to more than just cyber attacks was largely ignored. The institutional pressure to embrace technological solutions was overwhelming. Every training scenario was designed to reward officers who could quickly identify and deploy the most advanced systems available. Success was measured by how rapidly participants could establish communication networks, coordinate with air support, and utilize intelligence feeds to gain tactical advantages. Rebecca's methodical approach to environmental analysis and her preference for backup systems that didn't rely on technology were viewed as character flaws that needed to be corrected rather than alternative approaches that might have value. Major Williams led a particularly pointed critique during a tactical review session, questioning whether Rebecca's primitive methods were actually holding back the entire program. She argued that time spent on traditional navigation techniques was time stolen from learning cutting-edge systems that would actually be used in combat. Her presentation on drone swarm coordination was met with enthusiastic questions and approval. while Rebecca's quiet explanation of how natural weather patterns could ground entire drone fleets was dismissed as unnecessarily pessimistic thinking. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The psychological pressure was intense and constant. Rebecca found herself increasingly isolated from her peer group, who had formed a cohesive unit based on their shared enthusiasm for technological innovation. Their conversations during meals and breaks centered on the latest developments in military technology, comparing notes on equipment upgrades and sharing insights about emerging systems. Rebecca's attempts to contribute observations about environmental factors or traditional tactical principles were met with polite disinterest at best, open dismissal at worst. Morrison's evaluation reports consistently criticized Rebecca's failure to adapt to modern military realities. He documented her reliance on outdated methods and questioned whether she possessed the intellectual flexibility required for senior leadership positions in the contemporary military. His recommendations consistently emphasized the need for Rebecca to abandon her primitive approaches and embrace the technological solutions that represented the future of warfare. The cumulative effect of this constant criticism was designed to break down Rebecca's confidence in her own methods and force her to conform to the program's technological orthodoxy. Every exercise seemed deliberately structured to highlight the supposed superiority of digital systems over traditional approaches. When satellite communications worked perfectly and GPS navigation provided instant positioning data, Rebecca's emphasis on backup systems and environmental awareness seemed not just unnecessary but actively counterproductive. Yet something in Rebecca's demeanor suggested she was not discouraged by the criticism. She continued her methodical approach to environmental analysis, maintained her traditional navigation practices, and quietly observed patterns that others were too focused on their screens to notice. Her great-grandfather's teachings had prepared her for exactly this kind of institutional pressure, reminding her that the most important lessons often came from those who refused to abandon wisdom simply because it was old. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test not just different tactical approaches, but entirely different philosophies about what warfare required. Rebecca's ancient training was about to face its ultimate test against the most advanced military technology available. The question was whether thousands of years of indigenous wisdom could compete with artificial intelligence, satellite networks, and digital battlefield management systems. The answer would come sooner than anyone expected, in circumstances that would strip away every technological advantage and leave nothing but the most fundamental principles of survival and warfare. Rebecca's isolation deepened as the advanced training program entered its second phase, where theoretical knowledge would be tested through increasingly complex simulations designed to push participants beyond their comfort zones. The facility's most sophisticated scenario generators created virtual battlefields that incorporated every variable modern commanders might face, from urban warfare in dense metropolitan environments to desert operations where sandstorms could blind satellites and disrupt communication networks. Each simulation was crafted to reward technological adaptation and punish hesitation in deploying cutting-edge solutions. The morning briefing for Exercise Phantom Strike revealed the program's most ambitious scenario yet. A simulated enemy force had established positions across a mountainous region that bore striking resemblance to the Hindu Kush, complete with unpredictable weather patterns, limited visibility, and terrain that could swallow entire units without warning. The enemy had been programmed with sophisticated countermeasures against drone surveillance, electronic warfare capabilities that could disrupt satellite communications, and the kind of adaptive intelligence that made them formidable opponents. Even for technologically superior forces, Morrison's presentation of the scenario parameters was a masterclass in modern military thinking. He explained how participants would have access to real-time satellite imagery, predictive weather modeling, and artificial intelligence systems that could analyze enemy movement patterns and suggest optimal tactical responses. The exercise would test their ability to coordinate multiple assets simultaneously, from air support to ground units to cyber warfare specialists, operating thousands of miles away. Success would be measured by how quickly participants could establish dominance through technological superiority. Rebecca listened to the briefing with the same quiet intensity she brought to every aspect of the program. While her colleagues frantically took notes about equipment specifications and communication protocols, she was studying the topographical displays with different eyes. Where others saw elevation markers and grid coordinates, she recognized patterns that spoke of ancient pathways, natural shelters, and environmental factors that no computer algorithm could fully capture. Her great-grandfather's teachings had trained her to read landscapes like living documents, understanding how seasons, weather, and natural cycles created opportunities and dangers that existed beyond the reach of technological sensors. The exercise began at dawn, with participants scattered across individual command centers, equipped with every conceivable piece of modern equipment. Multiple screens displayed real-time intelligence feeds, communication networks hummed with constant chatter, and sophisticated planning software calculated optimal routes and timing for complex operations. The atmosphere was electric with the kind of excitement that came from wielding the most advanced military technology on the planet. Captain Chun immediately launched into an aggressive cyber warfare campaign, attempting to disrupt enemy communications, while simultaneously protecting his own networks from retaliation. His fingers flew across multiple keyboards as he coordinated with virtual support teams, implementing the kind of sophisticated electronic warfare tactics that had made him a rising star in his field. The early results were promising, with enemy communications showing signs of interference and their response times beginning to slow. Major Williams deployed her drone swarms with the precision of a conductor leading an orchestra, coordinating multiple units to provide overlapping surveillance coverage while maintaining tactical flexibility. Her screens showed feeds from dozens of unmanned vehicles, each providing different perspectives on the battlefield and contributing to a comprehensive picture of enemy positions and movements. The technology was mesmerizing in its complexity and effectiveness, creating tactical advantages that previous generations of warriors could never have imagined. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson's artificial intelligence systems began generating predictive models based on enemy behavior patterns, suggesting optimal timing for various tactical options and identifying potential vulnerabilities in enemy defensive positions. His approach was methodical and data-driven, treating warfare as a complex problem that could be solved through superior analysis and computational power. The IS recommendations were sophisticated and nuanced, taking into account hundreds of variables that human commanders might miss. Rebecca's approach stood in stark contrast to her technology-focused peers. She began by spending precious minutes studying the terrain displays, not for tactical positions, but for environmental clues that might affect operations throughout the day. She noted wind patterns that could affect aircraft performance, identified natural corridors that might channel enemy movement, and recognized elevation changes that could create communication dead zones even for advanced systems. Her analysis was intuitive and holistic, based on understanding how natural forces might interact with human operations. The first indication that something was wrong came 30 minutes into the exercise, when Chun's sophisticated cyber warfare systems began experiencing unexpected interference. The enemy's countermeasures were more advanced than anticipated, and his attempts to disrupt their communications were being neutralized by adaptive protocols that seemed to learn from each attack. His confident predictions about establishing electronic dominance were crumbling as the enemy demonstrated capabilities that shouldn't have existed in a training scenario. Williams discovered that her drone swarms were being systematically eliminated, by enemy air defenses that had somehow evaded detection by satellite surveillance. The sophisticated coordination she had established was falling apart as individual units were picked off by weapon systems that appeared to be operating independently of any centralized command structure. Her screens began showing gaps in coverage that widened with each passing minute, leaving dangerous blind spots in what should have been comprehensive battlefield awareness. Johnson's artificial intelligence system started generating increasingly erratic predictions as the enemy's behavior patterns proved more complex than the algorithms could accommodate. The computational models that had seemed so sophisticated were failing to account for tactical approaches that didn't fit established patterns. His recommendations became contradictory and unreliable, forcing him to abandon the systematic approach that had been his greatest strength. Meanwhile, Rebecca's methodical environmental analysis was beginning to reveal patterns that the technological systems had missed. She noticed that enemy movements seemed to be following natural pathways that provided cover from satellite observation, using terrain features and weather patterns to mask their positions and intentions. Her traditional navigation skills allowed her to anticipate how environmental factors might affect operations, giving her insights that pure technological analysis couldn't provide. The simulation's complexity increased as virtual weather patterns began affecting technological systems in ways that participants hadn't anticipated. Satellite communication started experiencing interference from atmospheric conditions that the predictive models had underestimated. GPS systems began showing decreased accuracy as natural phenomena created navigation challenges that backup systems couldn't immediately resolve. The technological advantages that had seemed so overwhelming were beginning to reveal their vulnerabilities. Morrison watched the unfolding scenario with growing concern. The exercise had been designed to showcase the superiority of technological approaches, but the sophisticated enemy programming was proving more challenging than expected. His star pupils were struggling to adapt as their preferred systems failed to provide the decisive advantages they had come to expect. The confidence that had characterized the early phases of the program was giving way to frustration and confusion. Rebecca's performance remained steady throughout the technological failures that were affecting her peers. Her reliance on traditional navigation methods meant that GPS interference didn't disrupt her operations. Her emphasis on environmental awareness allowed her to anticipate weather-related challenges that caught others off guard. Her understanding of natural terrain features helped her identify tactical opportunities that satellite imagery couldn't reveal. The psychological pressure intensified as participants realized that their technological advantages were being systematically neutralized. Chun's cyber warfare expertise was proving ineffective against enemy systems that seemed to operate independently of traditional electronic infrastructure. Williams' drone operations were being countered by defensive measures that appeared to anticipate her tactical approaches. Johnson's artificial intelligence was generating increasingly unreliable recommendations as enemy behavior patterns exceeded the system's analytical capabilities. As the exercise progressed, Rebecca began implementing tactical approaches that drew on her ancestral training. She used natural terrain features to mask her movements, timing operations to take advantage of weather patterns that would provide cover from enemy observation. Her understanding of environmental factors allowed her to identify enemy positions based on subtle clues that technological sensors couldn't detect. Her traditional navigation skills enabled her to operate effectively even when satellite systems were compromised. The other participants began to notice that Rebecca's performance was remaining consistent while their own technological advantages were being eroded. Her calm demeanor contrasted sharply with their growing frustration as sophisticated systems failed to provide the decisive edge they had expected. Her methodical approach to environmental analysis was yielding tactical insights that pure technological analysis couldn't match. Morrison's evaluation of the exercise was becoming increasingly complicated as the results didn't conform to his expectations. The technological approaches that should have dominated the scenario were proving vulnerable to enemy countermeasures that exploited their dependence on electronic systems. Rebecca's traditional methods were demonstrating resilience that his theoretical framework couldn't easily explain. The growing tension between different tactical philosophies was creating fractures within the participant group. Those who had invested heavily in technological solutions were beginning to question whether their approaches were as universally superior as they had believed. Rebecca's consistent performance was forcing uncomfortable questions about the reliability of systems that had seemed invincible. The stage was being set for a more dramatic confrontation as the exercise's complexity continued to increase. Environmental factors were beginning to play a larger role in tactical outcomes, and traditional skills were proving more relevant than anyone had anticipated. The question was whether the program's technological orthodoxy could accommodate approaches that didn't fit its established paradigms. Rebecca's quiet confidence was beginning to look less like stubbornness and more like wisdom as her methods proved effective in circumstances where technological solutions were failing. Her ancestral training was revealing its value in ways that surprised even her, demonstrating that ancient wisdom might have more relevance to modern warfare than anyone had imagined. The exercise was far from over, and the challenges ahead would test every assumption about warfare, technology, and the relationship between human intuition and mechanical precision. The real test was just beginning, and it would reveal truths that would shake the foundations of everything the program represented. The simulation entered its critical third phase as virtual enemy forces launched a coordinated offensive that exposed every weakness in the participants' technology-dependent strategies. What had begun as a manageable training exercise was evolving into something that resembled actual combat conditions, where adaptability mattered more than equipment. Specifications and survival depended on fundamental tactical principles rather than sophisticated gadgets. The artificial intelligence controlling enemy forces had been programmed with adaptive learning capabilities that exceeded everyone's expectations, creating challenges that pushed beyond the comfortable boundaries of classroom theory. Rebecca's tactical approach began revealing layers of complexity that her peers had consistently underestimated. While they scrambled to re-establish communication networks and restore compromised systems, she was implementing strategies that drew from generations of warfare knowledge accumulated by Apache warriors who had survived against overwhelming technological odds. Her great-grandfather's teachings had emphasized that true tactical superiority came from understanding your environment so completely that you could turn natural forces into weapons and use enemy strengths against them. The mountainous terrain of the simulation contained geographic features that Rebecca recognized from childhood stories passed down through her family. Her grandmother had described similar landscapes where Apache bands had successfully evaded much larger military forces. By using knowledge that couldn't be learned from books or transmitted through electronic systems, every ridge, valley, and seasonal water source had tactical significance that became apparent only through intimate familiarity with how natural cycles affected human movement and survival. Captain Chun's cyber warfare capabilities, which had seemed invincible during earlier phases, were being systematically dismantled by enemy countermeasures that operated on principles he didn't understand. His sophisticated electronic attacks were being absorbed and redirected by defensive systems that appeared to function independently of traditional network architectures. The frustration in his voice was evident as he communicated with virtual support teams who were reporting complete failure of protocols that had never failed during previous exercises. The enemy's cyber defense strategy seemed to incorporate elements that Chun's training had never addressed. Instead of relying solely on technological countermeasures, they were using tactical approaches that minimized dependence on electronic systems, while maximizing the vulnerability of forces that couldn't operate without constant digital connectivity. His attempts to restore communication networks were being defeated by an opponent that had apparently learned to fight effectively even when completely disconnected from modern infrastructure. Major Williams faced similar challenges as her drone. Operations encountered defensive measures that seemed to anticipate every tactical approach she had mastered. Enemy air defenses were eliminating her unmanned vehicles through methods that didn't appear on any sensor, using techniques that suggested intimate knowledge of how technological systems could be defeated through environmental manipulation rather than direct confrontation. Her screens showed rapidly diminishing assets as her sophisticated coordination systems were reduced to isolated units operating without central command. The enemy's anti-drone strategy was revealing vulnerabilities in technological warfare that Williams had never considered. They were using natural terrain features to create radar shadows, timing their movements to coincide with weather patterns that degraded sensor effectiveness, and employing decoy techniques that confused even the most advanced targeting systems. Her training had focused on technological solutions to technological problems, but she was facing an opponent that understood how to exploit the fundamental limitations of mechanical systems. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson's artificial intelligence systems were producing increasingly erratic results as enemy behavior patterns proved too complex for algorithmic analysis. The computational models that had seemed so sophisticated were failing to account for tactical approaches that drew from non-linear thinking and cultural knowledge that couldn't be quantified. His recommendations became contradictory as the AI struggled to process information that didn't fit established parameters for rational decision-making. The enemy's tactical unpredictability was exposing fundamental limitations in artificial intelligence. Applications to warfare. Johnson's systems had been designed to analyze patterns and predict outcomes based on historical data, but they were encountering approaches that deliberately violated conventional military logic. The IS inability to understand cultural and environmental factors that influenced enemy behavior was creating blind spots that grew larger with each failed prediction. Rebecca's performance during this critical phase began demonstrating the true value of traditional tactical knowledge. Her understanding of weather patterns allowed her to predict when atmospheric conditions would interfere with satellite communications, giving her opportunities to operate while enemy forces were temporarily blinded. Her knowledge of natural navigation techniques enabled her to maintain operational effectiveness even when GPS systems were compromised by electronic warfare attacks. The ancestral wisdom that had seemed so primitive was revealing sophisticated understanding of environmental factors that modern technology struggled to quantify. Rebecca's ability to read terrain features for tactical opportunities was based on knowledge systems that had been refined through centuries of survival in hostile environments. Her great-grandfather's teachings had emphasized that successful warriors must become so attuned to their surroundings that they could anticipate changes before technological sensors detected them. As the simulation progressed, Rebecca began implementing tactical maneuvers that drew from Apache warfare traditions, adapted for contemporary applications. She used natural concealment techniques that made her forces invisible to thermal imaging systems by understanding how environmental factors affected heat signatures. Her timing of operations was based on knowledge of atmospheric conditions that created windows of opportunity invisible to technological analysis. The traditional navigation skills that had been dismissed as obsolete were proving invaluable as electronic systems failed under enemy countermeasures. Rebecca's ability to maintain accurate positioning using natural landmarks and celestial navigation enabled her to coordinate operations while her peers struggled with compromised GPS systems. Her understanding of how seasonal changes affected water sources and vegetation patterns provided tactical intelligence that satellite imagery couldn't duplicate. Morrison watched the exercise unfold with growing bewilderment as his theoretical framework failed to explain what he was witnessing. The technological superiority that should have guaranteed success was being systematically neutralized by an enemy that seemed to understand vulnerabilities he had never considered. Rebecca's consistent performance was becoming impossible to ignore as her methods proved effective in circumstances where advanced systems were failing. The exercise parameters began revealing complexities that challenged fundamental assumptions about modern warfare. Environmental factors were playing larger roles in tactical outcomes than anyone had anticipated, and technological systems were proving more fragile than theoretical models suggested. The sophisticated equipment that had seemed invincible was demonstrating vulnerabilities that could be exploited by opponents who understood how to turn technological dependence into weakness. Rebecca's tactical approach was incorporating elements that her peers couldn't understand because they lacked the cultural and environmental knowledge necessary to recognize their significance. Her use of natural timing cycles was based on understanding seasonal patterns that affected everything from animal behavior to wind directions. Her positioning of forces took advantage of terrain features that provided concealment from multiple types of sensors simultaneously. The growing gap between Rebecca's performance and that of her technology-dependent peers was creating cognitive dissonance among instructors who had built their careers on the assumption that technological advancement automatically translated into tactical superiority. Her methods were achieving results that sophisticated systems couldn't match, using knowledge that couldn't be programmed into computers or transmitted through electronic networks. The enemy's adaptive capabilities were revealing the limitations of technological solutions to complex tactical problems. Their ability to learn from each encounter and modify their approaches was overwhelming systems designed to respond to predictable patterns. Rebecca's traditional methods were proving more adaptable because they were based on fundamental principles that remained relevant regardless of technological circumstances. As the exercise entered its most challenging phase, the distinction between primitive and sophisticated approaches was becoming increasingly blurred. Rebecca's ancient training was demonstrating relevance that surprised even her, while cutting-edge technology was failing in ways that exposed fundamental misconceptions about the relationship between advancement and effectiveness. The stage was being set for a dramatic confrontation between different philosophical approaches to warfare, where the ultimate test would not be technological sophistication, but the ability to adapt to circumstances that existed beyond the reach of electronic systems. The question was whether traditional wisdom could compete with artificial intelligence, and the answer was beginning to emerge in ways that challenged everything the program represented. Rebecca's quiet confidence was transforming from apparent stubbornness into obvious competence as her methods proved effective in increasingly challenging circumstances. Her ancestral training was revealing depths of tactical knowledge that modern military education had never fully appreciated, demonstrating that some forms of wisdom transcended technological advancement. The real test was accelerating toward a climax that would force everyone involved to reconsider their assumptions about warfare, technology, and the source of true tactical superiority. The ancient training that had been dismissed as obsolete was preparing to demonstrate its value in the most dramatic way possible. The simulation reached its breaking point as a cascading series of system failures created conditions that no amount of technological preparation could have anticipated. What had begun as a sophisticated training exercise was transforming into something that resembled the chaos of actual combat, where split-second decisions determined survival in theoretical knowledge proved worthless without practical application. The artificial intelligence controlling enemy forces had evolved beyond its original parameters, creating tactical scenarios that pushed every participant beyond their comfort zones and into territory where adaptability mattered more than equipment. Specifications: a massive electromagnetic pulse scenario, triggered by the enemy's desperation gambit, swept across the virtual battlefield with devastating effect. Every electronic system within the simulation experienced simultaneous failure, from communication networks to navigation equipment, to the sophisticated targeting systems that had formed the backbone of modern tactical operations. The pulse wasn't just disrupting individual devices. It was creating a technological blackout that stripped away every advantage that participants had relied upon throughout their military careers. Captain Chun's cyber warfare command center went dark in an instant, leaving him staring at blank screens that had been displaying real-time intelligence feeds just moments before. His sophisticated electronic countermeasures, carefully crafted algorithms, and network penetration tools became useless artifacts in a world where electronic infrastructure had ceased to exist. The silence in his command center was deafening after hours of constant digital chatter, and the realization that his entire tactical approach had been rendered obsolete hit him like a physical blow. The electromagnetic pulse had eliminated not just his offensive capabilities, but his basic ability to understand what was happening on the battlefield. Without electronic intelligence feeds, he was blind to enemy movements, unable to coordinate with friendly forces, and completely dependent on backup systems that had never been designed to replace his primary electronic arsenal. His years of specialized training in digital warfare had prepared him for technological competition, not for operating in an environment where technology itself had become the casualty. Major Williams watched her drone command screens flicker and die, taking with them the aerial superiority that had defined her tactical approach. Hundreds of unmanned vehicles, each representing millions of dollars in development and sophisticated artificial intelligence, were falling from the sky like mechanical rain. Her carefully coordinated swarm operations, which had seemed so elegant and overwhelming, were reduced to scattered debris across a battlefield where traditional air support no longer existed. The loss of her drone assets meant more than just the elimination of surveillance capabilities. Williams had built her entire tactical philosophy around the assumption that technological superiority could provide decisive advantages in any conflict. Her training had focused on managing complex systems that could overwhelm enemy defenses through sheer technological sophistication, but she had never learned to operate effectively when those systems were removed from the equation. The electromagnetic pulse had stripped away her professional identity along with her equipment. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson's artificial intelligence systems experienced complete failure as the pulse corrupted data streams and severed connections to the massive computational networks that powered his predictive modeling. The algorithms that had seemed so sophisticated were revealed as dependent on constant connectivity to function effectively. Without access to real-time data processing, his tactical recommendations became outdated within minutes, and his ability to analyze complex battlefield situations was reduced to whatever knowledge he could process with his own limited cognitive capabilities. The failure of his AI systems exposed fundamental limitations in Johnson's approach to warfare. His reliance on computational analysis had never been balanced with development of intuitive decision-making skills that remained effective when technological support was unavailable. The artificial intelligence that had seemed like an extension of his own tactical thinking was revealed as a crutch that had prevented him from developing the kind of independent analytical capabilities that crisis situations demanded. Rebecca's response to the electromagnetic pulse was markedly different from her peers' panic and confusion. While others struggled to comprehend the magnitude of their technological losses, she was already adapting her tactical approach to take advantage of opportunities that the pulse had created. Her training had always emphasized redundancy and self-reliance, preparing her to operate effectively even when conventional support systems were unavailable. The elimination of electronic infrastructure leveled the playing field in ways that favored traditional tactical knowledge over technological sophistication. The leather journal that had seemed so quaint during earlier phases of the exercise suddenly became invaluable as the only reliable method for recording tactical information. Rebecca's hand-drawn maps, annotated with environmental observations and tactical notes, provided situational awareness that electronic systems could no longer deliver. Her compass, worn smooth by decades of use, became the primary navigation tool for operations that had previously relied on satellite positioning systems. The electromagnetic pulse had created conditions that closely resembled the environments where Apache warriors had developed their tactical traditions. Without electronic communication, forces had to rely on visual signals, natural landmarks, and intuitive understanding of terrain features to coordinate operations. Rebecca's ancestral knowledge included techniques for maintaining unit cohesion and tactical effectiveness even when conventional command structures were disrupted or eliminated. Morrison's observation of the unfolding crisis forced him to confront the fundamental assumptions that had guided his entire career. The technological superiority that had seemed so decisive was proving fragile when confronted with countermeasures that eliminated its operational foundation. His star pupils, who had excelled in environments where electronic systems provided overwhelming advantages, were struggling to adapt to circumstances where human judgment and traditional skills determined outcomes. The exercise parameters were revealing complexities that challenged every theoretical framework the program had been built upon. Environmental factors that had been dismissed as minor variables were becoming primary determinants of tactical success. Natural phenomena that sophisticated sensors had been designed to overcome were proving more reliable than the technological systems that had supposedly replaced them. The electromagnetic pulse had created an environment where ancient wisdom was more relevant than artificial intelligence. Rebecca began implementing tactical approaches that drew from Apache warfare traditions specifically developed for fighting technologically superior opponents. Her understanding of natural concealment techniques enabled her to move forces without being detected by the primitive optical systems that remained operational after the pulse. Her knowledge of environmental factors allowed her to predict weather changes that would affect visibility and movement, giving her tactical advantages that couldn't be replicated through technological means. The traditional navigation skills that had been dismissed as obsolete were proving essential for maintaining operational effectiveness in an environment where electronic positioning systems were unavailable. Rebecca's ability to determine direction using natural landmarks, celestial navigation, and terrain features enabled her to coordinate complex operations while her peers struggled with basic orientation problems. Her understanding of how seasonal changes affected water sources and vegetation patterns provided tactical intelligence that remained accurate even when satellite imagery was inaccessible. The enemy forces, operating under similar technological constraints, were proving more adaptable than anyone had anticipated. Their tactical approaches seemed to incorporate elements that suggested familiarity with operating in environments where electronic systems were unreliable or unavailable. Rebecca's traditional methods were proving effective against opponents who understood how to exploit technological dependencies, while her peers' advanced training was leaving them vulnerable to tactics that their education had never addressed. As the simulation progressed without electronic support, the gap between Rebecca's performance and that of her technology-dependent peers became increasingly apparent. Her methods were achieving tactical objectives that sophisticated systems had failed to accomplish, using knowledge that had been refined through centuries of warfare in challenging environments. The electromagnetic pulse had created conditions where traditional wisdom provided advantages that artificial intelligence couldn't match. The psychological impact of the technological failure was devastating for participants who had built their professional identities around mastery of electronic systems. Shun's confidence in cyber warfare was shattered by the realization that his entire tactical approach could be neutralized by a single electromagnetic pulse. William's faith in technological superiority was undermined by the discovery that her Sophisticated systems were more fragile than the simple tools they had supposedly replaced. Johnson's reliance on artificial intelligence was revealed as a fundamental weakness when computational support was unavailable. His inability to make effective tactical decisions without algorithmic assistance exposed gaps in his military education that had been masked by technological sophistication. The crisis was forcing him to confront the reality that his advanced systems had prevented him from developing the kind of independent, analytical skills that effective leadership required. Rebecca's traditional approach was demonstrating resilience that surprised even her instructors. Her methods remained effective, regardless of technological circumstances, because they were based on fundamental principles that transcended equipment specifications. The electromagnetic pulse had created conditions where her ancestral training provided advantages that modern military education couldn't duplicate. The stage was being set for a dramatic revelation that would challenge every assumption about warfare, technology, and the source of true tactical superiority. The crisis had stripped away the comfortable illusions that had guided military thinking for decades, creating circumstances where ancient wisdom would prove more valuable than artificial intelligence. The question was whether traditional knowledge could provide solutions to problems that sophisticated technology had failed to solve, and the answer was beginning to emerge in ways that would transform everyone's understanding of what warfare actually required. The simulation's final phase presented an unprecedented challenge that would test every remaining capability of the participants. With all electronic systems eliminated by the electromagnetic pulse, the enemy had launched a coordinated offensive that threatened to overrun defensive positions across the entire theater of operations. Intelligence reports, delivered by human runners since communication networks no longer functioned, indicated that 43 virtual soldiers were trapped in a remote outpost surrounded by superior enemy forces. The rescue mission would require navigating treacherous mountain terrain without GPS, coordinating complex operations without radio communication, and achieving tactical objectives that had seemed impossible even with full technological support. Morrison's briefing for the rescue operation was delivered in person, a dramatic departure from the digital presentations that had characterized the program's earlier phases. His voice carried the weight of desperation as he explained that conventional military approaches had failed to establish contact with the trapped unit. Multiple rescue attempts using standard tactical procedures had been repelled by enemy forces that seemed to understand exactly how technologically dependent units would respond to crisis situations. The mission parameters were brutal in their simplicity. Reach the outpost within 6 hours, extract the trapped soldiers, and return them to safety using whatever methods remained available. The other participants approached the mission with the kind of methodical planning that had served them well during peacetime training exercises. Chun began developing communication protocols that relied on visual signals and predetermined rally points, attempting to recreate the coordination capabilities that electronic systems had previously provided. His approach was logical and systematic, but it was also based on assumptions about how military units should operate that had never been tested in environments where technological support was completely unavailable. Williams focused on planning helicopter insertions that would compensate for the loss of her drone assets, calculating fuel requirements and flight paths that would minimize exposure to enemy air defenses. Her tactical thinking remained sound within the parameters she understood, but she was struggling to adapt to circumstances where the technological advantages that had defined her career were no longer relevant. The sophisticated coordination techniques she had mastered required electronic systems that no longer existed. Johnson attempted to recreate his artificial intelligence capabilities through manual analysis, using paper maps and statistical calculations to predict enemy movements and identify tactical opportunities. His mathematical approach to warfare was impressive in its complexity, But it was also time-consuming and dependent on accurate information that was increasingly difficult to obtain. The computational power that had made his recommendations so sophisticated was beyond the reach of human calculation, leaving him with analytical tools that were inadequate for the mission's demands. Rebecca's response to the rescue mission was fundamentally different from her peers' technological substitution strategies. Instead of trying to recreate electronic capabilities through manual methods, she was drawing from tactical traditions that had been developed specifically for operations in environments where technological support was unavailable. Her great-grandfather's teachings included detailed knowledge of how Apache warriors had conducted rescue operations in hostile territory, using natural navigation techniques and environmental awareness to achieve objectives that larger, better-equipped forces had failed to accomplish. The mountain terrain of the simulation was based on geographic features that Rebecca recognized from family stories about Apache resistance campaigns. Her ancestors had operated in similar environments for generations, developing tactical knowledge that enabled small groups to move through hostile territory undetected while coordinating complex operations without electronic communication. The landscape held cultural significance that provided tactical advantages invisible to conventional military analysis. Rebecca's mission planning incorporated elements that her peers couldn't understand because they lacked the environmental knowledge necessary to recognize their tactical value. Her route selection was based on understanding seasonal water sources, natural shelter locations, and terrain features that would provide concealment from multiple types of observation simultaneously. Her timing calculations took into account weather patterns, atmospheric conditions, and natural cycles that affected everything from visibility to enemy behavior patterns. The traditional navigation techniques that had seemed so primitive were proving essential for operations in terrain where electronic positioning systems were useless. Rebecca's ability to determine direction using natural landmarks, celestial navigation, and terrain features enabled her to plan routes that would remain accurate even when environmental conditions changed. Her understanding of how seasonal variations affected vegetation patterns and water availability provided tactical intelligence that remained reliable regardless of technological circumstances. As the mission commenced, the distinctions between sophisticated and primitive tactical approaches became increasingly blurred. Rebecca's environmental awareness enabled her to predict weather changes that would affect visibility and movement, giving her tactical advantages that meteorological instruments couldn't provide. Her knowledge of natural concealment techniques allowed her to move through hostile territory without being detected by enemy forces that were specifically watching for conventional military approaches. The enemy's defensive strategy seemed designed to exploit the technological dependencies that had characterized modern military operations. Their positioning took advantage of terrain features that degraded electronic sensor effectiveness while providing natural advantages for forces that understood how to use environmental factors as tactical weapons. Rebecca's traditional methods were proving effective against opponents who had learned to defeat technological superiority through environmental manipulation. The rescue operation's complexity increased as Rebecca encountered challenges that required tactical solutions her peers had never studied. Enemy forces were using natural terrain features to create ambush positions that couldn't be detected through conventional reconnaissance methods. Their movement patterns seemed to follow seasonal migration routes and natural pathways that provided concealment from aerial observation while enabling rapid deployment to defensive positions. Rebecca's response to these challenges drew from Apache warfare traditions that had been refined through centuries of conflict with technologically superior opponents. Her understanding of natural camouflage techniques enabled her to approach enemy positions without being detected by visual observation or thermal imaging systems. Her knowledge of environmental factors allowed her to predict when atmospheric conditions would create opportunities for tactical movement that Conventional timing couldn't anticipate the traditional communication methods that had been dismissed as obsolete were proving essential for coordinating operations in an environment where electronic systems were unavailable. Rebecca's use of natural signals, terrain features, and prearranged rally points enabled her to maintain unit cohesion while moving through hostile territory. Her understanding of how environmental factors affected sound transmission allowed her to coordinate complex operations without alerting enemy forces to her presence. As the mission progressed, Rebecca's tactical approach began revealing the true depth of knowledge that her ancestral training had provided. Her ability to read terrain features for tactical opportunities was based on understanding systems that had been developed through generations of survival in hostile environments. Her timing of operations was synchronized with natural cycles that created windows of opportunity invisible to conventional military analysis. The enemy's adaptive capabilities were proving more sophisticated than anyone had anticipated, but Rebecca's traditional methods were matching their tactical innovations through environmental understanding that artificial intelligence couldn't replicate. Her approach to warfare was based on fundamental principles that remained relevant regardless of technological circumstances, providing tactical advantages that couldn't be programmed into computers or transmitted through electronic networks. Rescue operation success began to depend on tactical skills that modern military education had never fully appreciated. Rebecca's ability to navigate using natural landmarks was proving more reliable than electronic positioning systems that had been designed to replace traditional navigation methods. Her understanding of environmental factors was providing tactical intelligence that remained accurate even when sophisticated sensors were unavailable. Morrison's observation of the unfolding operation was forcing him to confront the reality that his theoretical framework couldn't explain what he was witnessing. Rebecca's traditional methods were achieving tactical objectives that sophisticated systems had failed to accomplish, using knowledge that had been dismissed as primitive superstition. Her performance was demonstrating that ancient wisdom might be more relevant to modern warfare than artificial intelligence. The stage was being set for a dramatic climax that would test every assumption about warfare, technology, and the source of true tactical superiority. The rescue mission was becoming a proving ground where traditional knowledge would demonstrate its value against the most advanced military thinking available. The question was whether ancient training could provide solutions to problems that sophisticated technology had failed to solve, and the answer was beginning to emerge in ways that would transform everyone's understanding of what warfare actually required. Rebecca's quiet confidence was being validated through practical application as her methods proved effective in circumstances where conventional approaches had failed. Her ancestral training was revealing tactical capabilities that modern military education had never fully understood, demonstrating that some forms of knowledge transcended technological advancement. The impossible mission was becoming possible through the application of wisdom that had been tested through centuries of conflict and refined through generations of survival. Rebecca's approach to the rescue mission unfolded with the precision of a masterclass in traditional warfare, demonstrating tactical capabilities that left even her harshest critics speechless. While her peers struggled with improvised solutions to technological failures, she was implementing strategies that had been tested through generations of Apache resistance against overwhelming odds. The mountain terrain that had seemed impossible to navigate without GPS systems became her ally, revealing pathways and opportunities that only someone trained in indigenous tactical traditions could recognize and exploit. The first phase of her rescue operation began with environmental analysis that went far beyond conventional military reconnaissance. Rebecca spent crucial minutes studying atmospheric conditions, wind patterns, and natural lighting that would affect operations throughout the day. Her observations weren't based on meteorological instruments or satellite data, but on knowledge, systems that had been refined through centuries of survival in hostile environments. She identified weather patterns that would create tactical opportunities invisible to conventional planning, timing her movements to coincide with natural phenomena that would provide concealment and strategic advantages. Her route selection incorporated understanding of seasonal wildlife patterns that affected enemy positioning and movement capabilities. Apache warriors had learned to predict how animal behavior would reveal human presence in the landscape, and Rebecca applied this knowledge to identify enemy observation posts and patrol routes that conventional reconnaissance couldn't detect. Her path through the mountains followed natural corridors that provided concealment from multiple types of surveillance simultaneously, while avoiding terrain features that could channel movement into predictable patterns. The traditional navigation techniques that had been dismissed as obsolete were proving more reliable than any electronic system could have been. Rebecca's use of natural landmarks, celestial positioning, and terrain features enabled her to maintain accurate direction and timing even when weather conditions reduced visibility to mere yards. Her understanding of how seasonal changes affected vegetation patterns and water sources provided tactical intelligence that remained current regardless of when satellite imagery had last been updated. As she approached the enemy perimeter surrounding the trapped outpost, Rebecca implemented concealment techniques that drew from Apache traditions specifically developed for infiltrating superior forces. Her understanding of natural camouflage went beyond simple visual deception, incorporating knowledge of how environmental factors affected thermal signatures, sound transmission, and scent dispersal. She moved through hostile territory with the kind of invisibility that only comes from complete harmony with natural systems. The enemy defensive positions were sophisticated and well coordinated, designed to exploit the technological dependencies that had characterized modern military operations. Their surveillance networks relied on overlapping fields of observation that would detect any conventional approach to the outpost. Their patrol patterns were calculated to provide maximum coverage of likely infiltration routes, while maintaining rapid response capabilities to any detected intrusion. The defensive strategy seemed impenetrable to forces that depended on technological solutions to tactical problems. Rebecca's response to these challenges revealed the true sophistication of traditional warfare knowledge. Her approach to the enemy perimeter wasn't based on overwhelming force or technological superiority, but on understanding environmental factors that created opportunities for tactical movement. She identified natural phenomena that would temporarily degrade enemy observation capabilities, timing her infiltration to coincide with atmospheric conditions that provided concealment from multiple types of sensors simultaneously. The breakthrough moment came when Rebecca recognized terrain features that her cultural knowledge identified as historically significant tactical positions. Her ancestors had used similar geographic formations during resistance campaigns, developing specific techniques for approaching fortified positions through environmental manipulation rather than direct assault. The landscape itself became her weapon as she used natural features to create tactical advantages that enemy forces couldn't anticipate or counter. Her infiltration of the enemy perimeter was accomplished through methods that seemed impossible to observers who lacked understanding of traditional warfare principles. Rebecca's movement through hostile territory was synchronized with natural cycles that affected everything from wind patterns to animal behavior. Her timing was based on knowledge of how atmospheric conditions created windows of opportunity that lasted only minutes but provided decisive tactical advantages to forces that understood how to recognize and exploit them. The rescue of the trapped soldiers required coordination techniques that had never been taught in modern military academies. Rebecca's communication with the isolated unit was accomplished through traditional signaling methods that couldn't be intercepted or decoded by enemy forces. Her understanding of natural acoustics enabled her to transmit tactical information across distances that electronic systems couldn't bridge, using environmental features to amplify and direct sound in ways that seemed almost Supernatural to conventional military thinking, the extraction operation revealed the true depth of Rebecca's tactical knowledge as she coordinated complex movements through hostile territory using methods that predated electronic communication by centuries. Her understanding of natural timing cycles enabled her to synchronize multiple elements of the operation without relying on technological coordination systems. The rescued soldiers followed her lead through terrain that seemed impassable, using routes that only someone with intimate knowledge of environmental systems could have identified. Morrison watched the operation unfold through whatever primitive observation systems remained functional after the electromagnetic pulse, witnessing tactical performance that challenged every assumption about modern warfare. Rebecca's methods were achieving objectives that sophisticated technology had failed to accomplish, using knowledge that had been dismissed as irrelevant to contemporary military operations. Her success rate was perfect while conventional approaches had achieved nothing but casualties and failed missions. The enemy's response to Rebecca's tactical innovations revealed the limitations of defensive strategies designed to counter technological approaches to warfare. Their sophisticated countermeasures were ineffective against tactics that operated independently of electronic systems, and their coordination began breaking down as they encountered approaches that their training had never addressed. Rebecca's traditional methods were exploiting vulnerabilities in modern defensive thinking that had been created by over-reliance on technological solutions. Captain Chun's attempted coordination of conventional rescue efforts was failing spectacularly, as his improvised communication systems proved inadequate for the mission's complexity. His logical approach to tactical problems was being defeated by enemy countermeasures that exploited his dependence on systematic procedures. The visual signals and predetermined rally points that had seemed like reasonable substitutes for electronic communication were proving too rigid and predictable for operations in hostile territory. Major Williams' helicopter insertion attempts were being systematically defeated by enemy air defenses that had been positioned to exploit conventional tactical thinking. Her approach to the rescue mission was based on technological solutions that no longer existed, and her inability to adapt to environmental factors was resulting in mission failures that endangered additional personnel. The sophisticated coordination techniques she had mastered required systems that had been eliminated by the electromagnetic pulse. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson's manual analysis of enemy positions was producing recommendations that were consistently wrong because his mathematical models couldn't account for environmental variables that affected tactical outcomes. His computational approach to warfare was failing when applied to problems that required intuitive understanding of complex natural systems. The statistical calculations that had seemed so sophisticated were revealing their limitations when confronted with tactical situations that couldn't be quantified. Rebecca's successful extraction of all 43 trapped soldiers was accomplished using traditional techniques that had been refined through generations of Apache warfare. Her understanding of natural concealment methods enabled the entire group to move through hostile territory without being detected by enemy forces that were specifically watching for rescue attempts. Her knowledge of environmental factors allowed her to predict when atmospheric conditions would provide opportunities for tactical movement that couldn't be anticipated through conventional analysis. The return journey through enemy territory demonstrated the superiority of traditional navigation techniques over technological systems that had failed when most needed. Rebecca's use of natural landmarks and terrain features enabled her to guide the rescued soldiers through routes that remained accurate even when weather conditions changed dramatically. Her understanding of seasonal variations in water sources and vegetation patterns provided tactical intelligence that ensured the group's survival during the extended operation. As the successful rescue mission concluded, the implications of what had been accomplished were beginning to dawn on everyone involved. Rebecca's traditional methods had achieved tactical objectives that the most sophisticated military technology had failed to accomplish. Her ancient training had proved more valuable than artificial intelligence, satellite communications, and electronic warfare capabilities combined. The woman they had dismissed as living in the past had just demonstrated that the future of warfare might require remembering lessons that had been forgotten in the rush toward technological solutions. Stage was set for a final revelation that would transform everyone's understanding of what warfare actually required. Rebecca's miraculous success had proved that traditional knowledge possessed capabilities that modern military thinking had never fully appreciated, and the implications of this discovery would reshape tactical doctrine for generations to come. The aftermath of Rebecca's successful rescue mission created a profound silence in the debriefing room that spoke louder than any words could have. The 43 virtual soldiers she had extracted from certain death stood as living testimony to the effectiveness of tactical knowledge that had been dismissed as primitive superstition. Morrison stared at the mission reports with the expression of someone whose entire worldview had been systematically dismantled by undeniable evidence. The technological superiority that had formed the foundation of his military philosophy had been revealed as a dangerous illusion that left forces vulnerable to opponents who understood how to exploit their dependencies. The simulation's final statistics painted a picture that would reshape military thinking for generations to come. Rebecca's traditional methods had achieved a 100% success rate, while every technological approach had failed catastrophically. Her rescue operation had been completed without casualties, equipment losses, or detection by enemy forces that had been specifically programmed to counter modern military tactics. The electromagnetic pulse that had crippled sophisticated systems had enhanced her effectiveness by creating conditions that favored environmental knowledge over technological solutions. Captain Chun sat in stunned silence as he processed the implications of what had transpired. His entire career had been built on the assumption that cyber warfare represented the future of military operations, yet his sophisticated electronic capabilities had proven worthless when confronted with opponents who understood how to operate independently of technological infrastructure. The rescue mission had demonstrated that his specialized knowledge was more fragile than the primitive tools it had supposedly replaced, and his inability to adapt to circumstances without electronic support had endangered the very people he had been trained to protect. The psychological impact of his failure was devastating, because it challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of warfare itself. Chun had invested years in mastering systems that had been eliminated by a single electromagnetic pulse, while Rebecca's traditional knowledge had remained effective regardless of technological circumstances. Her methods had proven more resilient than artificial intelligence, more reliable than satellite communications, and more adaptable than the electronic warfare techniques that had defined his professional identity. Major Williams experienced a similar crisis of confidence as she confronted the reality that her drone operations had been systematically defeated by enemies who understood how to exploit the vulnerabilities of technological warfare. Her sophisticated coordination systems had proven less effective than traditional communication methods that had been developed centuries before electronic systems existed. The rescue mission had revealed that her advanced training had actually made her less capable in crisis situations where technological support was unavailable. The realization that her career had been built on flawed assumptions about military effectiveness was profoundly disturbing, because it suggested that the entire defense establishment had been moving in the wrong direction. Williams had been trained to believe that technological advancement automatically translated into tactical superiority, but Rebecca's success had demonstrated that some forms of knowledge transcended equipment specifications and remained relevant regardless of technological circumstances. Lieutenant Colonel Johnson's mathematical approach to warfare had been exposed as fundamentally inadequate when applied to problems that required intuitive understanding of complex natural systems. His artificial intelligence systems had failed to account for environmental variables that Rebecca's traditional knowledge had identified as crucial tactical factors. The computational power that had seemed so sophisticated was revealed as incapable of replicating the kind of holistic understanding that indigenous warfare traditions had developed through centuries of practical application. The failure of his predictive models was particularly troubling because it suggested that artificial intelligence might have inherent limitations that prevented it from competing with human intuition in certain tactical situations. Johnson had assumed that computational analysis could replace experiential knowledge, but Rebecca's success had proven that some forms of wisdom couldn't be programmed into computers or transmitted through electronic networks. Her traditional methods had achieved results that his sophisticated algorithms couldn't match. Morrison's transformation began with a painful acknowledgement of how completely his theoretical framework had failed to predict or explain what had occurred during the exercise. The woman he had dismissed as living in the past had demonstrated tactical capabilities that surpassed every technological innovation the military had developed. Her ancient training had proved more valuable than satellite communications, artificial intelligence, and electronic warfare systems combined, forcing him to reconsider every assumption about modern military effectiveness. The institutional implications of Rebecca's success were staggering because they suggested that the entire military establishment had been pursuing technological solutions to problems that required environmental understanding and cultural knowledge. Morrison realized that his emphasis on equipment specifications and digital systems had actually made forces less capable of operating in circumstances where technological support was compromised or unavailable. The rescue mission had revealed dangerous vulnerabilities in military thinking that had been created by over-reliance on sophisticated systems. Rebecca's quiet dignity during the debriefing session stood in stark contrast to the emotional turmoil experienced by her peers. She had never sought to prove the superiority of traditional methods, but circumstances had forced a confrontation between different philosophical approaches to warfare. Her ancestral training had prepared her for exactly this kind of challenge, emphasizing that true tactical knowledge must remain effective regardless of technological circumstances. Environmental conditions. That the depth of her traditional knowledge was revealed through detailed explanations of how Apache warfare principles had been adapted for contemporary applications. Her understanding of natural navigation systems, environmental concealment techniques, and weather pattern analysis was based on knowledge that had been refined through generations of survival in hostile environments. Her success had demonstrated that indigenous tactical traditions possess sophistication that modern military education had never fully appreciated or understood. The rescue mission's success had profound implications for military doctrine because it suggested that technological advancement might have created as many vulnerabilities as advantages. Rebecca's traditional methods had exploited weaknesses in modern defensive thinking that had been created by assumptions about how warfare should be conducted. Her environmental knowledge had provided tactical intelligence that satellite systems couldn't duplicate, and her natural navigation skills had proven more reliable than electronic positioning systems. Major General Hawkins arrived at the debriefing session with the intention of conducting a routine evaluation of training effectiveness, but she instead found herself confronting evidence that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying military modernization efforts. Rebecca's performance had demonstrated that traditional knowledge possessed capabilities that artificial intelligence couldn't replicate, and her tactical success had been achieved using methods that the military had systematically eliminated from its training programs. That the general's response to the exercise results was immediate and decisive. She recognized that Rebecca's traditional knowledge represented a strategic asset that the military couldn't afford to ignore, and she authorized the creation of a new training program that would integrate indigenous tactical principles with contemporary military operations. Her decision reflected understanding that technological superiority alone was insufficient for military effectiveness, and that environmental knowledge and cultural wisdom had tactical value that transcended equipment specifications. The transformation of the Advanced Tactical Training Center began with the establishment of the Indigenous Warfare Studies program, designed to preserve and transmit traditional knowledge that had proven its effectiveness during the rescue mission. Rebecca was appointed as the program's director, charged with developing curricula that would teach environmental navigation, natural concealment techniques, and cultural tactical principles to officers who had been trained exclusively in technological approaches to warfare. The program's impact extended far beyond the boundaries of Fort Braxton as military leaders recognized that Rebecca's success had revealed fundamental flaws in contemporary tactical thinking. Her traditional methods were studied and adapted for implementation across multiple theaters of operation, creating a renaissance of interest in indigenous warfare knowledge that had been dismissed as obsolete. The rescue mission had proven that ancient wisdom possessed relevance that artificial intelligence couldn't match. Chun's personal transformation was perhaps the most dramatic as he abandoned his exclusive focus on cyber warfare to study the environmental principles that had made Rebecca's success possible. His technical expertise provided unique insights into how traditional knowledge could be integrated with contemporary systems, creating hybrid approaches that combined the resilience of indigenous methods with the capabilities of modern technology. His conversion from skeptic to advocate demonstrated the profound impact of witnessing traditional tactics in action. Williams redirected her career toward developing training programs that would prepare pilots to operate effectively when technological support was compromised or unavailable. Her experience with drone operations provided valuable perspectives on how electronic systems could be made more resilient through integration with traditional navigation and communication methods. Her transformation reflected growing recognition that technological advancement required balance with fundamental tactical knowledge. Johnson's mathematical background enabled him to analyze the principles underlying Rebecca's traditional methods, developing theoretical frameworks that explained why indigenous tactics had proven more effective than artificial intelligence in certain situations. His research contributed to understanding of how environmental knowledge could be preserved and transmitted through contemporary educational systems, bridging the gap between ancient wisdom and modern military science. The long-term implications of Rebecca's demonstration extended throughout the military establishment as leaders recognized that over-reliance on technology had created vulnerabilities that opponents could exploit. Her success had revealed that true military effectiveness required balance between technological capabilities and fundamental tactical knowledge that remained relevant regardless of equipment specifications or environmental conditions. The Indigenous Warfare Studies program became a model for military education that emphasized environmental understanding, cultural knowledge, and traditional tactical principles, alongside technological training. Rebecca's teaching methods combined practical field exercises with theoretical instruction, ensuring that future military leaders would possess the kind of balanced knowledge that had enabled her remarkable success during the rescue mission. Years later, military historians would identify Rebecca's demonstration as a pivotal moment that reshaped tactical doctrine and restored balance to military thinking. Her quiet revolution had proven that the most advanced warfare knowledge sometimes came from the oldest sources, and that true tactical superiority required understanding that transcended technological specifications. The woman they had dismissed as living in the past had shown them the future of warfare, and it looked remarkably like the wisdom of their ancestors. The legacy of her success continued to influence military operations decades later as commanders trained in traditional methods achieved tactical victories that pure technological approaches couldn't match. Rebecca's ancient training had saved not just 43 virtual soldiers, but the future of warfare itself, proving that some lessons are too valuable to be forgotten and too fundamental to be replaced by artificial intelligence. Her story became required reading for military leaders who understood that the most sophisticated weapon systems were useless without the wisdom to employ them effectively, and that true tactical knowledge must remain effective regardless of technological circumstances. The ripple effects of Rebecca's demonstration spread throughout international military communities as foreign defense establishments recognized the strategic implications of her traditional warfare knowledge. Allied nations began requesting access to her training methodologies, understanding that environmental tactical principles could provide decisive advantages in regions where technological infrastructure was vulnerable or non-existent. Her techniques were adapted for Arctic operations, jungle warfare, and desert campaigns where satellite communications faced natural interference and GPS systems encountered atmospheric disturbances. The Pentagon's formal adoption of indigenous warfare principles represented a fundamental shift in military philosophy that acknowledged the limitations of purely technological approaches to conflict. Rebecca's success had revealed that sophisticated equipment could become a liability when opponents understood how to exploit technological dependencies, and her traditional methods offered solutions to vulnerabilities that artificial intelligence couldn't address. The integration of ancestral knowledge with contemporary military science created hybrid tactical approaches that combined the best elements of both worlds. Rebecca's personal journey from mockery to recognition culminated in her appointment to the Joint Chiefs of Staff as the first Indigenous Warfare Advisor, a position created specifically to ensure that traditional knowledge would remain integrated with strategic planning at the highest levels. Her quiet strength and proven effectiveness had earned respect that transcended rank and protocol, and her voice became influential in discussions about military readiness and tactical innovation. The woman who had walked into Fort Braxton with nothing but a leather satchel and compass had become one of the most powerful figures in American defense. The transformation of military education extended beyond tactical training to include cultural studies, environmental science, and indigenous knowledge preservation as essential components of officer development. Rebecca's curriculum emphasized that effective leadership required understanding human factors that couldn't be quantified through data analysis, and that tactical excellence demanded harmony between technological capabilities and fundamental survival principles. Her graduates went on to command positions where they implemented balanced approaches to warfare that honored both innovation and tradition. The global recognition of Rebecca's contributions to military science culminated in the establishment of the Elena Stone Institute for Indigenous Warfare Studies, named in honor of her great-grandfather, who had first preserved the Apache tactical knowledge that had proven so decisive. The institute became a center for research and training that attracted military leaders from around the world, seeking to understand how traditional wisdom could enhance contemporary operations. Rebecca's vision had evolved from personal vindication to institutional transformation that would influence warfare for generations to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.